We arrived in Panama City on January 18th, a Monday, in mid-afternoon. Our Rhodes Scholar program, all canal all the time for 4 days, would start first thing Tuesday morning. When we arrived at our hotel, we saw that although it wasn't the newest, it was perfectly situated right along the water, at the mouth of the canal on the Pacific side. I was amused to see that they had misspelled earthquake on the sign, and a little less than amused to think about possible seismic activity. Before supper, I went out for a walk along the water. I could see the Bridge of the Americas, which spans the canal, a ship just positioning itself to start its transit of the canal, lots of tugs and commercial vessels anchored just offshore, and a chandler's truck pulled up, unloading supplies. The next morning, we had an orientation lecture and then headed out. Because we were 51 in our group, we took 3 buses and 3 guides. We started at the monument to the chief engineers who built the canal, notably the last one, Goethals, a colonel in the Army Corps of Engineers. Roosevelt was said to have picked him because after some bad luck with the previous engineers, he wanted someone who couldn't quit. Goethals did complete the canal and went on to serve as the canal zone's first governor. The administration building for the canal is up on the hill. We were allowed into the foyer where they have some old murals of the construction phase. From up there, we could also see across to the cranes at the port. A lot of cargo doesn't actually travel by ship through the canal. Panama has made itself into a multimodal logistics hub, and lots of cargo is unloaded on one side, trucked or sent by rail across the isthmus, and then put on another ship on the other side. Quite a coordination feat. Next, we went down to the Old City, stopping at a bust of Charles V, the Spanish king who was one of the first, at least on paper, to think of a canal. That was back in 1534. We also visited the ruins of an old church that played a part in selling Panama as the site for the canal over Nicaragua. After the failed French attempt, the Americans were trying to decide on a route, and Nicaragua was looking pretty good to them. The French company, though, still owned the rights to the Panamanian route and was trying to recover some of their money, $40 million worth, by selling them to the Americans. One of the French agents pointed out to Congress that Nicaragua had so much volcanic activity that they even put a volcano on their stamps. By contrast, he took a model of this church arch in Panama City into his presentation to show them that it had held up for 100 years or more in Panama, so there was nothing to worry about there. Quite a showman. Then we walked through the old city on our way to the Canal Museum, stopping at various monuments, including one to the doctors who had figured out how to prevent yellow fever. We also got a view of the harbor, a long causeway, and the downtown core, which shows that Panama is the center for international commerce. Our guides were all wearing undershirts, but I was as hot as I wanted to be. Back at the hotel that evening, we had dinner on the patio. On Wednesday, we stopped at several sites. The monument to the Chinese community marked 150 years of Chinese presence in Panama. Out of town, we stopped at Madden Dam, built in the 1930s to create another artificial lake to serve as a reservoir for the canal, which uses about 50 million gallons of fresh water for each transit. You can see that although they had a sign thanking people for using the garbage cans, there was a lot of litter on the ground. We also stopped at a memorial to those who had died in the French efforts. Not a real cemetery, but memorial crosses. You could hardly see the crosses in the grass, but the whole area was covered. Estimates range up to as high as 20,000 people who died in their attempt to build a canal. Then we went to Miraflores locks. The Pacific side has 2 sets of locks, Miraflores and Pedro Miguel, with a total of 3 chambers. The Atlantic side has just one, Gatun, with 3 chambers in a row. In both cases, they raise or lower ships a total of 85 feet, which doesn't sound like all that much until someone puts a shovel in your hand. We were able to watch ships going through the locks from the observation tower. The little locomotives, seen in action on the top left and close up on the bottom right, hook onto the ships with cables from either side and help to guide them evenly through the locks. But they're not pulling, apparently, just guiding. On Thursday, we checked out of our hotel first thing and got onto our little wooden boat, apparently with some connection to Al Capone, and we're ready to transit the canal, paired with a big tanker and another tour boat. We got our own canal pilot, who transferred to us mid-river. We went past our hotel and past the downtown area. And then we went under the Bridge of the Americas into the canal proper. The first locks we came to were Miraflores again. The doors closed, and we started the lift. We could see the observation tower that we had stood on the afternoon before, and some of the locomotives lined up, ready for action. As we exited the lock, we could see a huge crane off to our left. It was servicing a door from one of the locks. The small boat in front of it gives some sense of the scale. Then we got to the second of the two locks on the Pacific side, Pedro Miguel. Note the arrow on the left showing ships which side to go on. And so we snuggled up in the lock again with the tanker and the passenger vessel doing a tour of the locks. And the whole process was repeated, this time with double doors. As we left Pedro Miguel locks, we were at the highest point on the canal. Ahead of us was the part that had been the most difficult to construct, the Culebra Cut, about 12 kilometers through the mountains. Terribly difficult digging and all kinds of problems in the rainy seasons with landslides that undid weeks or months of work in just a few hours. On the slopes of the hills on the left, you can see the terracing that they still use to reduce erosion. The Centennial Bridge marks the southern end of the Culebra Cut. We sailed through this section, the narrowest part of the canal, but then our trip was at an end. We had been supposed to transit the whole canal, but our boat had engine problems and the tanker we were following was behind schedule. Ships go through northbound for part of the day and then southbound. So if you're late, you have to pull over, anchor, and get back in line the next day or as soon as the schedule permits. So we disembarked at Gamboa and took a bus the rest of the way to Colón on the Atlantic coast. They put us in a swanky hotel that had been used by the Americans as a foreign military or intelligence school. Apparently Noriega, later the Panamanian dictator, attended the school as a young officer. Early Friday morning, I went out for pictures. The hotel property was surrounded on three sides by water. As I took this shot, I could hear the howler monkeys over in the trees. On Friday, we toured the construction works at Gatun Locks, where they're doubling the number of lock chambers, building a whole other set in parallel to the existing ones. We were even able to drive across the locks at one point on a temporary road with the bridge that swings out of the way for canal traffic. It gave us an interesting perspective on some of that lock traffic. Then we went out to see where the French had started their digging. Now it just looks like a lazy river channel, and the enormous earthworks and dam that made Gatun Lake. At that time, I think it may have been the most earth moved for any engineering project anywhere. Our guides also found us a sloth, very kindly hanging out on a low branch. Then we went back to Gatun Locks, the part now in operation. They have some of the original locomotives on display. We watched as several ships transited the lock chambers, almost in slow motion. After that, it was time to go back to Panama City on the railroad. Our guide had it fixed for us to ride in the glass-topped observation car, so we had one last view of the canal. That evening, we had our farewell supper, complete with a folk dancing presentation, and on Saturday morning, before we had to leave for the airport, I got a few shots of the street outside our hotel. That concluded our trip. 4 wonderful days focused on all aspects of the Panama Canal.